is no love child of jazz, says Charlie Parker, the creator of bop, in a series of interviews that took more than 2 weeks. Told us he felt that bop is something entirely separate and apart from the older tradition, that it drew little from jazz, has no roots in it. The chubby little alto man, who has made himself an international music name in the last 5 years, added that bop, for the most part, had to be played by small bands. He stated, "Gillespie's playing has changed from being stuck in front of a big band. Anybody's does. He's a fine musician. The leopard coats and the wild hats are just another part of the manager's routines to make him box office. The same thing happened a couple of years ago when they stuck his name on some tunes of mine to give him a better commercial reputation." Asked to define bop after several evenings of argument, Charlie was still not precise in his definition. "It's just music," he said. "It's trying to play clean and looking for the pretty notes." Pushed further, he said that a distinctive feature of bop is its strong feeling for beat. "The beat in a bop band is with the music, against it, behind it," Charlie said. "It pushes it, it helps it. Help is the big thing. It has no continuity of beat, no steady chug-chug. Jazz has, and that's why bop is more flexible." He admits the music eventually may be atonal. Park himself is a devout admirer of Paul Hindemith, the German neoclassicist, raves about his Kammermusik and Sonata for viola and cello. He insists, however, that bop is not moving in the same direction as modern classical. He feels that it would be more flexible, more emotional, more colourful. He reiterates constantly that bop is only just beginning to form as a school, that it can barely label its present trends, much less make prognostications about the future. The closest Parker will come to an exact technical description of what may happen is to say that he would like to emulate the precise, complex, harmonic structures of Hindemith, but with an emotional colouring and dynamic shading that he feels modern classical lacks. Parker's indifference to the revered jazz tradition certainly will leave some of his own devotees in a state of surprise. But, actually, he himself has no roots in traditional jazz. During the few years he worked with traditional jazzmen, he wandered like a lost soul. In his formative years, he never heard any of the music which is traditionally supposed to inspire young jazzists. No Lewis, no Bix, no Hawke, no Bennett, no nothing. His first musical idol, the musician who so moved and inspired him that he went out and bought his first saxophone at the age of 11, was Rudy Vallee. Tossed into the jazz world of the mid-30s with this kind of background, he had no familiar ground on which to stand. For 3 years he fumbled unhappily until he suddenly stumbled on the music which appealed to him, which had meaning to him. For Charlie insists, music is your own experience, your thoughts, your wisdom. If you don't live it, it won't come out of your horn. Charlie's horn first came alive in a chili house on 7th Avenue between 139th Street and 140th Street in December 1939. He was jamming there with a guitarist named Biddy Fleet. At the time, Charlie says he was bored with the stereotyped changes being used then. "I kept thinking there's bound to be something else," he recalls. "I could hear it sometimes, but I couldn't play it." Working over Cherokee with Fleet, Charlie suddenly found that by using higher intervals of a chord as a melody line and backing them with appropriately related changes, he could play this thing he had been hearing. Fleet picked it up behind him and bop was born. Or at least it is reasonable to assume that this was the birth of bop. All available facts indicate this is true. But Parker, an unassuming character who carries self-effacement to fantastic lengths, will not say this in so many words. The closest he will come to such a statement is, "I'm accused of having been one of the pioneers." But inescapable facts pin him down. He says he always has tried to play in much or less the same way he does now. His earliest records, which were cut with Jay McShane in 1940 on Decca, back him up on this. They reveal a style which is rudimentary compared to his present work, but definitely along the same lines: light, vibrato-less tone, running phrases, perkily turned, complex rhythmic and harmonic structures. From 1939 to 1942, Charlie worked on his discovery. He admits he thought he was playing differently from other jazzmen during this period. Indicative of his queasiness about saying who did what, before, with, which, to whom, is his answer to our query, did Dizzy also play differently from the rest during the same period? I don't think so, Charlie replied. Then, after a moment, he added, I don't know, he could have been. Quote me as saying yeah. Dizzy himself has said that he wasn't aware of playing bop changes before 1942. Whether he'll admit it or not, the calendar shows that Charlie inaugurated what has come to be known as bop. In some circles, he is considered to be the world's only legitimate bopist. There's only one man really plays bop, one New York Reed musician said recently. That's Charlie Parker. All the others who say they're playing bop are only trying to imitate him. Despite his unwillingness to put anybody down, a slight note of irritation creeps into Charlie's usually bland mien when he considers the things which have been done by others in an attempt to give his music a flamboyant commercial appeal. The fact that Dizzy Gillespie's extroversions led the commercially minded to his door irks Charlie in more ways than one. As part of Dizzy's build-up, he was forced to add his name to several of Charlie's numbers, among them Anthropology, Confirmation and Shaw's Nuff. Dizzy has nothing to do with any of them, according to Charlie. As for the accompanying gimmicks, which to many people represent bop, Charlie views them with a cynical eye. Some guy said, here's bop, he explains. Wham, they said. Here's something we can make money on. Wham. Here's a comedian. Wham. Here's a guy who talks funny talk. Charlie shakes his head sadly. Charlie himself has stayed away from a big band because the proper place for bop, he feels, is a small group. Big bands tend to get overscored, he says, and bop goes out the window. The only big band that managed to play bop in 1944, in Charlie's estimation, was Billy Eckstine's. Dizzy's present band, he says, plays bop, could be better, with more settled down and less personnel shifting. That big band is a bad thing for Diz, he says. A big band slows anybody down because you don't get a chance to play enough. Diz has an awful lot of ideas when he wants to, but if he stays with a big band, he'll forget everything ever played. He isn't repeating notes yet, but he is repeating patterns. The only possibility for a big band, he feels, is to get really big, practically on a symphonic scale with loads of strings. This has more chance than the standard jazz instrumentation, he says. You can pull away some of the harshness with the strings and get a variety of colorization. Born in Kansas City, Kansas in 1921 to a family which was in relatively comfortable circumstances at the time, Charlie moved with his parents to Olive Street in Kansas City, Missouri when he was 7. There were no musicians in his family, but Charlie got into his high school band playing baritone horn and clarinet. He had a special fondness for the baritone horn because it helped him win medals awarded to outstanding musicians in the band. Not that he played the horn particularly well, but it was loud and boisterous and dominated the band so much the judges scarcely could ignore it. In 1931, Charlie discovered jazz, heavily disguised as Rudy Vallee. So that he could emulate Rudy, his mother bought him an alto for $45. Charlie settled on the alto because he felt C melody wasn't stylish and a tenor didn't look good. His interest in the alto was short-lived, however, for a sax-playing friend in high school borrowed it and kept it for 2 years. Charlie forgot all about it until he was out of school and needed it to earn a living. It was back in his school days, he says, that his name started going through a series of mutations which finally resulted in Bird. As Charlie reconstructs it, it went from Charlie to Yarley to Yarl to Yard to Yardbird to Bird. After his brief exhilaration over Vallee, Charlie heard no music which interested him outside of boogie-woogie records until he quit high school in 1935 and went out to make a living with his alto horn at the age of 14. As has been mentioned, he was under the influence of none of the jazz greats. He had never heard them. He was influenced only by the necessity of making a living, and he chose music because it seemed glamorous, looked easy, and there was nothing else around. This primary lack of influence continued as the years went by. The sax men he listened to and admired, Herschel Evans, Johnny Odgers, Willie Smith, Ben Webster, Don Byas, Bud Johnson, all played with a pronounced vibrato. but no semblance of a vibrato ever crept into Charlie's style. "I never cared for vibrato," he says, "because they used to get a chin vibrato in Kansas City, and I didn't like it. I don't think I'll ever use vibrato." The only reed man on Charlie's list of favourites who approached the Byrds' vibrato style was Lester Young. "I was crazy about Lester," he says. "He played so clean and beautiful, but I wasn't influenced by Lester. Our ideas ran on differently." When Charlie first ventured onto the music scene in Kansas City, the joints were running full blast from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. Usual pay was $1.25 a night, although somebody special like Count Basie could command $1.50. There were about 15 bands in town, with Pete Johnson's crew at the Sunset Cafe, one of the most popular. Harlan Leonard was in town then, along with George Lee's and Bus Morton's little bands. Lester Young, Herschel Evans and Eddie Bearfield were playing around. Top local pianists were Rosalind Claxton, Mary Lou Williams, Ethel Williams and Basie. Charlie spent several months picking up on his alto. On Thanksgiving night 1935 he got his first chance to play for pay, when he was rounded up with a small group of others to do a gig in Eldon, Missouri. He was offered $7 for the night, not because he was any good, but because practically every musician in Kansas City was working that night, and the guy who hired him was going crazy trying to find men to fill the date. Driving to Eldon, they had a crack-up. 2 of the men were killed, and Charlie got out of it with 3 broken ribs. The man who had hired him paid his medical expenses and bought him a new horn. In February 1936, Charlie started out for Eldon again with another group, and this time he made it. The rest of the combo was a shade older than Charlie. J.K. Williams, the bass player, was 72. The rest were in their 30s and 40s. Charlie was 15. But, as the baby of the group, he got a lot of attention and advice. He had taken guitar, piano and sax books with him and set about learning to read seriously. The pianist, Carrie Powell, played for him and taught him simple major, minor, seventh and diminished chords. By the end of the Eldon job in April, he could read fairly well, but not quickly. He went back to Kansas City and got his first job at 18th and Lydia at either the Panama or the Florida Blossom, he can't remember which. It paid him 75 cents a night. The main idea of the job, Charlie recalls, was to be there and hold a note. Soon after this he tried jamming for the first time at the Hyatt at 22nd and Vine. He knew a little of Lazy River and Honeysuckle Rose and played what he could. He didn't find it difficult to hear the changes because the numbers were easy and the reed men set a riff only for the brass, never behind a reed man. No 2 horns jammed at the same time. "I was doing all right until I tried doing double tempo on Body and Soul," Charlie says. "Everybody fell out laughing. I went home and cried. I didn't play again for 3 months." In 1937 he joined J. McShann's band, but left after 2 weeks. Later he was arrested for refusing to pay a cab fare. His mother, who didn't approve of his conduct then, wouldn't help him out and he was jugged for 22 days. When he got out, he left his saxophone behind and bummed his way to New York. For 3 months he washed dishes at Jimmy's Chicken Shack in Harlem. This was at the time Art Tatum was spellbinding late-hour shack habitués. Charlie got $9 a week and meals. Then he quit and bummed around a while, sleeping where he could. "I didn't have any trouble with cops," he recalls. "I was lucky, I guess. It was because I looked so young." He was 17. After he had been in New York for 8 months, some guys at a jam session bought him a horn. With it he got a job in Kew Gardens, which lasted for 4 months, even though he hadn't touched a horn for 1.5 years. Then he moved into Monroe's Uptown House with Ebenezer Paul on drums, Dave Riddick on trumpet and 2 or 3 other guys. There was no scale at Monroe's. Sometimes Charlie got 40 or 50 cents a night. If business was good, he might get up to $6. "Nobody paid me much more than except Bobby Moore, one of Count Basie's trumpet players," Charlie says. "He liked me. Everybody else was trying to get me to sound like Benny Carter." Around this time, the middle of 1939, he heard some Bach and Beethoven for the first time. He was impressed with Bach's patterns. I found out that what the guys were jamming then already had been put down, and in most cases a lot better. At the end of 1939, shortly after his Chili House session with Biddy Fleet, he went to Annapolis to play a hotel job with Banjo Burney. Then his father died and he went back to Kansas City, where he rejoined McShann. Charlie cut his first records in Dallas in the summer of 1940 with McShann. His first sides were Confessing, Hootie's Blues, which he wrote, Swingmatism, and Vine Street Boogie. His solos with McShann are on Hootie, Swingmatism, Serpian's Bounce, Lonely Boy Blues, and Jumping Blues. He tried doing a little arranging then, but he didn't know much about it. I used to end up with the reeds blowing above the trumpets, he explains. The McShann band went from Texas to the Carolinas to Chicago, back to Kansas City, headed east through Indiana, and then to New York and the Savoy. Charlie drove the instrument truck all the way from Kansas City. While they were at the Savoy, Charlie doubled into Monroe's, where he played with Alan Terry, piano, George Treadwell, Sarah Vaughan's husband, and Victor Coulson, trumpets, Ebenezer Paul, bass, and Mole, drums. He left McShann at the end of 1941 and joined Earl Hines in New York in early 1942. This was the Hines band, which also had Dizzy, Billy Eckstein, and Sarah Vaughan. Charlie had known Dizzy vaguely before this, and it was about this time that they both started getting into some sessions at Minton's. It was on this visit to New York in late 1942, after he had worked out his basic approach to complex harmony, that Charlie heard Stravinsky for the first time when Ziggy Kelly played Firebird for him. Charlie played tenor for the 10 months he was with Hines. He started out getting more money than he had ever seen before, $105 a week. With McShann he had gotten $55 to $60, but the band was sent on an army camp tour in a Pabst Blue Ribbon Salute package put together by Ralph Cooper, and their salaries started going down. This, with booking hassles, eventually broke up the band. Charlie dropped out in Washington in 1943 and joined Sir Charles Thomson, Robin's Nest composer, at the Crystal Caverns. Later he came back to New York and cut his first sides since the McShann disc, the Tiny Grimes Red Cross and Romance Without Finance session for Savoy. Charlie worked off and on around New York during 1943 and 1944. In the spring of 1944 he was playing the Spotlight on 52nd Street, managed by Clark Monroe of Monroe's, and on the site of the old famous door, when Doris Sidner, the hat-check girl there, raised an interested eye in him. Charlie, according to Doris, didn't notice it. He ignored me very coldly, she reports. But Doris was a persistent girl. She didn't even know what instrument Charlie played when she first met him, but she stacked records by the Bird and Lester Young on her phonograph and listened until she caught on to what they were doing. She and Charlie were married on November 18, 1945 in New York. Right after his wedding, Charlie went out to the coast with Dizzy to play at Billy Berg's. He stayed there after the Berg date was finished. On the coast he started cutting sides for Ross Russell's Dial label until his physical breakdown in August 1946 landed him in an hospital. His opinion of these Dial discs is low. "Birdlaw and Loverman should be stomped into the ground," he says. "I made them the day before I went to the hospital. I had to drink a quart of whiskey to make the date." Charlie stayed in the hospital until January 1947. Russell, who had hired a psychiatrist and a lawyer, got him released then into his custody and staged a benefit for the Bird which produced some cash and 2 plane tickets back east. But Parker is bitter about Russell's role in this. He says that Charlie Emge of Downbeat was equally helpful, that Russell refused to sign the papers releasing him unless he, Parker, renewed his contract with Dial. Later, Parker claims he found that he had needed no outside help to get out. When he originally signed with Russell, Charlie was already under contract to Herman Lubinsky of Savoy Records. Before leaving New York, he had signed with Lubinsky to cut some 30 sides. 4 of these were done before he went to the coast: Coco, Billy's Bounce, Now's the Time, and Anthropology. Lubinsky bought all 4 tunes from Charlie for $50 apiece. Today Charlie has come full circle, as he did in 1939, when he kicked off Bop in the 7th Avenue Chili House. He's beginning to think there's bound to be something more. He's hearing things again. things that he can't play yet. Just what these new things are, Charlie isn't sure. But from the direction of his present musical interests, Hindemith, etc., it seems likely he's heading towards atonality. Charlie protests when he's mentioned in the same sentence with Hindemith, but despite their vastly different starting points, he admits he might be working towards the same end. This doesn't mean Charlie's through with bop. He thinks bop still is far from perfection, and looks on any further steps he may take as further developments of bop. They teach you there's a boundary line to music, he says, but man, there's no boundary line to art. For the future, he'd like to go to the Academy of Music in Paris for a couple of years, then relax for a while, and then write. The things he writes all will be concentrated towards one point, warmth. While he's writing, he also wants to play experimentally with small groups. Ideally, he'd like to spend 6 months a year in France and 6 months here. You've got to do it that way, he explains. You've got to be here for the commercial things and in France for relaxation facilities. Relaxation is something Charlie constantly has missed. Lack of relaxation, he thinks, has spoiled most of the records he has made. To hear him tell it, he has never cut a good side. Some of the things he did on the Continental label he considers more relaxed than the rest, but every record he has ever made could stand improvement, he says. We tried to pin him down, to get him to name a few sides that are at least better than the rest. Suppose a guy came up to us, we said, and said, I've got 4 books and I want to buy 3 Charlie Parker records. What'll I buy? What should we tell him? Charlie laughed. Tell him to keep his money, he said. We both were tremendously impressed by the cogency and clarity of Parker's thinking about music. Musicians, classical or jazz, are traditionally unanalytical about the things they create. Parker, however, has a definite idea of where he wants to go and what he wants to do, though he is properly vague as to the results. His insistent vagueness as to exactly what bop is to him is no pose. Parker is a musician fighting for his proper mode of expression, a vastly talented man who hasn't the schooling yet to expand as completely and properly as his musical instincts would have him do. If we understand his criticisms correctly, Parker feels that traditional jazz has strongly lacked variety and economy of form, as well as the wealth of discipline and control of ideas to be found in modern formalistic music. On the other hand, he feels the symphonic score of today lacks drive, contained perhaps in his concept of dynamics, and warmth, and that his group of musicians will help inject these aspects traditional to the jazz scene. Parker's insistence that bop has no connection with jazz is interesting as an example of a young musician bursting forms which he finds constricting and which he feels have outlived their usefulness. We suspect his position might be difficult to maintain. He undoubtedly is seriously searching for a synthesis of the best in formalistic and folk music. If he can achieve it, he will pull off a feat seldom before accomplished in music. Many composers have utilised folk themes and folk feelings, but none has completely integrated the colours and emotional patterns into scored music. He is, like all good musicians, inordinately impressed with technique. He has a fondness for lush string tones that, as he uses more of it, will settle more into balance, as will his taste for such technical musicians as Jimmy Dorsey. Parker feels very strongly on the subject of dope in all its forms. He told us that while he was still a young boy in Kansas City, he was offered some in a men's room by a stranger when he hardly knew what it was. He continued to use it off and on for years until his crack-up in 1946, and says bitterly that people who prey on kids this way should be shot. Parker told us flatly, any musician who says he is playing better either on tea, the needle, or when he is juiced is a plain straight liar. When I get too much to drink, I can't even finger, well let alone play any decent ideas. And in the days when I was on the stuff, I may have thought I was playing better, but listening to some of those records now, I know I wasn't. Some of these smart kids who think you have to be completely knocked out to be a good hornman, or just plain crazy, it isn't true, I know, believe me. Parker struck us as being direct, honest and searching. He is constantly dissatisfied with his own work and with the music he hears around him. What will come of it? Where will his quite prodigious talent will take him, even he doesn't know at this stage. But his ceaseless efforts to find out, to correct, to improve, only bode well for himself and their elderly progenitor, jazz. On September 9th, 1949, Downbeat magazine printed an article on bebop jazz alto saxophonist Charlie Parker. The article began with the provocative statement by Parker, "Bebop is no love child of jazz." Parker goes on to differentiate between jazz and bebop, a distinction that is seldom made today. Artists from Louis Armstrong to Duke Ellington to Charlie Parker to Ornette Coleman are usually considered part of the same lineage. The writers characterize themselves as pushing Parker to define bop, and he is clearly uncomfortable doing so. Parker had recently returned from France, where he played at the May 1949 International Festival of Jazz. Reportedly, he had met French classical saxophone virtuoso Marcel Mule while in Paris. This article may be the first to quote Parker's intention to return to France to study European concert music, a plan that he never carried out. Importantly, he makes it clear that while he may gain some inspiration from European music, the music that he envisions will also have significant tracks that he does not associate with the European concert music tradition. Certain of Parker's statements we can clear straight away. Parker's birth year, reported as 1921, is actually 1920. His first Decca recordings with Jay McShann were made in 1941, not 1940. The Hindemith piece Parker had in mind was the duet for viola and cello. Parker's reference to the Academy of Music in Paris is unclear. He may have meant the Conservatoire National de Musique. On October 7, 1949, Dizzy Gillespie entered the debate with an article in Downbeat written by John S. Wilson. "Bird wrong, bop must get a beat, Diz." "The Bird is wrong about the relationship of bop and jazz," says Dizzy Gillespie. "Bop is an interpretation of jazz," Diz told Downbeat. "It's all part of the same thing. Last month Charlie Parker said that bop had no roots in jazz, was something entirely separate and apart from the older tradition. Parker identified the beat as the distinguishing factor of bop. It has no continuity of beat, no steady chug-chug, Parker said. This lack of a steady beat, according to Dizzy, is what is wrong with bop today. Bop is part of jazz, Dizzy said, and jazz music is to dance to. The trouble with bop, as it's played now, is that people can't dance to it. They don't hear those 4 beats. We'll never get bop across to a wide audience until they can dance to it. They're not particular about whether you're playing a flattened fifth or a ruptured 129th, as long as they can dance. The important characteristic of bop, Dizzy says, are the harmonics and the phrasing. Tossing in a variety of beats isn't essential. These are conclusions that Dizzy has reached after dragging his big band around the country for more than a year. As a result, he's revising his book so as to turn his outfit into a band that can be danced to. We'll use the same harmonics, he said, but with a beat so that people can understand where the beat is. We'll use a lot of things which are in the book now, but we'll cut them and splice them together again like you would a movie, so as to leave out the variations in beat. I'm not turning my back on bop. My band has a distinctive sound, and I want to keep that. But I want to make bop bigger, get it a wider audience. I think pianist George Shearing is the greatest thing that's happened to bop in the past year. He's the only one who has helped it along. He plays bop so the average person can understand it. Anybody can dance to Shearing's music. By doing that, he has made it easier for me and for everybody else who plays bop. It is interesting to note that in this interview, Gillespie does not make any reference to Parker's accusation of him adding his name to tunes that are solely Parker's. This article is also the source of the legendary story of Parker's 1939 musical breakthrough in Harlem. Note that in this original version, the account is largely told by paraphrasing Parker. In later books and articles, those paraphrases were represented as direct quotes of Parker, but it is unknown whether those alterations were based on Parker's actual statements, possibly tape recorded, or if they were journalistic license. In his 2005 thesis, Charlie Parker, The Analytical Study of 22 Performance Versions of Now's the Time, Volume 4, Jen Quan Chang explores the controversy and misuse of Parker's statement. Chang was only able to access a photocopy of the original article that was produced from a microfilm exhibiting only marginal print quality. However, the rendering you heard in Part 1 was taken direct from my copy of the original magazine. I can attest to Kwang's accuracy in reproducing the all-important Parker breakthrough statement. To quote Kwang, the article reveals that Parker's statement during a 1949 interview session was interpreted by interviewers Michael Levin and John S. Wilson. Charlie's horn first came alive in a chili house on 7th Avenue between 139th Street and 140th Street in December 1939. He was jamming there with a guitarist named Biddy Fleet. At the time, Charlie says he was bored with the stereotype changes being used then. I kept thinking there's bound to be something else, he recalls. I could hear it sometimes, but I couldn't play it. Working over Cherokee with Fleet, Charlie suddenly found that by using higher intervals of a chord as a melody line and backing them with appropriate related changes, he could play this thing he had been hearing. Fleet picked it up behind him and Bop was born. This interpretation has been used in several jazz publications and has become one of the key quotations used to explain the origins of bebop. For instance, Brian Priestley states in his 1984 publication, "Now I'd been getting bored with the stereotype changes, chords, that were being used all the time. I found that by using the higher intervals of a chord as a melody line and backing them with appropriate related changes, I could play the thing I'd been hearing." In Presley's book, the third-party interpretation of Parker's statement was represented as a first-person remark. This similar misuse can be found in other books. Gary Giddins, Celebrating Bird, The Triumph of Charlie Parker. His book Charlie Parker and Charlie Parker An Overview. Howard Lee's Jazz and Introduction. Robert Reisner's Bird, The Legend of Charlie Parker. Scott Sandvik's Polyharmony, Polymeter and Motive Development in Charlie Parker's Collective Widerstein. And Ken Vile's Bird's Diary. Carl Wodick, in his book Charlie Parker, His Music and Life, suggests that this misuse had been caused by the 1955 publication Hear Me Talking to Ya, in which the following statement is presented in a first-person format. I remember one night before Monroe's, I was jamming in a chili house on 7th Avenue between 139th and 140th. It was December 1939. Now I'd been getting bored with the stereotype changes that were being used all the time at the time, and I kept thinking there's bound to be something else. I could hear it sometimes, but I couldn't play it. Well, that night I was working over Cherokee, and as I did, I found that by using the higher intervals of a chord as a melody line and backing them with appropriate related changes, I could play the thing I'd been hearing. I came alive. In Ross Russell's Bird Lives, although Parker's interpreted statement is not presented in first-person format, Russell has clearly romanticised the interpreted statement in the 1949 Downbeat article into fictional writings. One morning at Dan Wall's Chili House, an all-night restaurant at 7th Avenue and 139th Street, Charlie was jamming with a rhythm section led by guitarist Biddy Fleet. They were working Cherokee. Charlie had been over the changes countless times and the tune was beginning to sound stale. Charlie got to thinking, There's got to be something more, some new way to go. Then an idea struck him. If he played the top notes of the chords instead of the middle or lower notes, he would have a new line. It was worth trying. Asking Biddy Fleet to continue, Charlie played through another chorus. The notes sounded strange, but it worked. He was using the upper intervals, 9ths, 11ths, 13ths, skimming along on the very tops of the chords. As to the actual meaning of appropriate related changes in Parker's interpreted statement, the information can be found in Roy Carr's A Century of Jazz, which presents Biddy Fleet's remarks regarding the use of the appropriate related changes, quoted in the following paragraph. The remark of guitarist Biddy Fleet, who participated in the Chili House jam session with Charlie Parker in 1939, as mentioned in the 1949 Downbeat article, might help researchers to further understand Parker's interpreted statement. As Biddy Fleet later explained to the writer Ira Gittler, the voicings of my chords had a theme within themselves. You could call a tune and I'd voice my chords in such a way that I'd play the original chords to the tune and I'd invert them every 1, 2, 3 or 4 beats so that the top notes of my inversions would be another tune. It would not be the melody to the tune I'm playing, yet the chords, foundation-wise, is the chords to the tune. In Bebop, the Music and Players, Thomas Owens clearly states the controversy regarding Parker's interpreted remarks in Downbeat, but his statement regarding appropriate related changes quoted in the following paragraph is questionable. Backing them with appropriate related chord changes is almost meaningless. The mental image of a saxophonist backing himself with any chord changes while playing his saxophone in a pre-electronic music age is surrealistic. Perhaps Parker in 1939 had a vision of the MIDI-led music environment of the 1980s. In Lawrence O. Koch's Yardbird Suite, a compendium of the music and life of Charlie Parker, Koch states that Parker told Leonard Feather, "For instance, we'd find that you could play a relative major using the right inversion against a 7th chord, and we played around with flattened fifths." Even though Koch's writing does not suggest that the statement regarding the harmonic breakthrough is Parker's first-person remark, it is still questionable to state this issue without referring to the original material. Taking into account Chang's criticism of Koch there, I think personally this is an important statement, and if you put this statement together with the original statement from the Downbeat magazine, you can kind of see what Parker's actually talking about when he's talking about we could play relative majors. It brings in something completely different to what everybody's been thinking about, and I will be explaining my theory on this in part 3. Okay, so I'll see you then. Bye.
Please. I want to introduce the brilliant young artist Anthony Hancock, who, as you know, has just completed a sculpture of my beautiful wife, Margot. I shall now ask the artist himself to reveal his work.
Oh, blimey. dare you?
Is this some joke?
Don't you like it?
Is this supposed to be my wife?
Well, yes, it's your wife as I see her.
Hello, welcome back to Bebop Review. My name is Andy Shaw. I just wanted to show you that short clip from the Tony Hancock film The Rebel to illustrate the negative reaction that Bebop had upon its first hearing by the general public and music critics. The music at that time had burst into an unexpected world on the back of a 2-year recording ban instigated by the American Federation of Musicians, or AMF. The most vocal critics were the New Orleans revivalist camp and some swing critics who stated that bebop was not jazz. In his 1949 interview for Downbeat and 1947 interview for Metronome, Charlie Parker tried to distance himself and bebop from the mainstream jazz line by claiming that bebop was not jazz and so hopefully silenced the critics. I don't think Parker really believed what he was saying. He just had enough which surely we can all understand. So let's not call it jazz, let's call it music. Parker also states in a 1949 interview that he was not influenced by any of the great players of the swing era. The interviewers state that his first influence was Rudy Vallee, but this is almost certainly a misquote. It should have read Rudy Wardorf, whom it is well known was Parker's first influence on saxophone. The headline in Downbeat screams, "Lester didn't influence me." However, this is also untrue because you can hear Lester Young's influence on Parker in his early Jay McShann recordings. Particularly on Lady Be Good. Parker may have insisted on no influence in jazz because of an interview with Lester Young in Downbeat on May 6, 1949. In the article entitled "Press Talks About Himself and Copycats," Young blasted the musicians of the day as being non-individuals. "The trouble with most musicians today is that they are copycats," he said. Parker didn't want to appear as a copycat, so this is why he may have said he wasn't influenced by anyone, but we know he was, especially in his early years. However, in my opinion, the biggest influence on Parker in the early 1940s was not Young, but guitarist Charlie Christian, whom Parker heard regularly at Monroe's. In his book, Charlie Parker, His Life and Legacy, Carl Wardeck shows how Parker quotes many players of the swing era. But quotes are not stylistic changes. In his early recordings, his stylistic model may have been Young, but his later style incorporated Christian, in my opinion. Charlie Christian may have died in 1942, but his legacy lived on in Charlie Parker. To understand the Levin Wilson breakthrough statement, we need first to look at part of a later Parker mature solo when his style was fully established. I have chosen the opening of Parker's Clun Stance purely at random. Okay, so I'm looking at Clun Stance, Charlie Parker solo. It's in the Charlie Parker Omnibook, this on page 89. If you want to go through this yourself and analyse it and then see what I get, as an exercise, you can do. That's if you're one of my subscribers. You should be able to analyse something like this now. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this 3 ways. I'm going to go through it like I usually do and show you what Parker's using. Then we're going to look at the voice leading, which is obviously part of this line. And then we're going to look at some of the interesting different notes as well. Okay? First of all, Parker starts his solo off. Well, it's not. This is the tune, but there's no theme to this tune. Parker just bursts straight into a solo. He starts off with a D major tetrachord rise, and as you can see, and then we'll go through a pair of normal changing tones. Normal changing tones, remember, are you start off at the note that you're going to finish on, which is that G. So here, the last note in this tetrachord is setting up a changing tone, right? Which you start at G. We go through these two changing tones here, then we're finishing on this G. Now this G is the fourth note of D major, or the 11th if you're talking about tensions, and the 11th is an avoid note. But Parker then, we'll just carry on. Parker then goes into M2, right? So he's elaborating it with that A. So A is part of D, so we're on a fourth beat of the bar, 1, 2, 3, 4, which is a weak beat, and then he's elaborating that A. So this avoid note it's nothing really, because it's on a weak beat anyway, and it's been elaborated by M2, which is actually putting in this A, which is part of D. So it's all right that. So let's see what he does next. Parker then goes into M3BA. This is just elaborating this F. It's basically, that's just F for 2 beats. But Parker's put this in, which is an elaboration on the F. So we've got voice leading. Look, we're going from this A to G to F. Right, so then see what else he does. Then we're going into M1. So if we're on this F, he's gone up by arpeggio, and he's taking us up to that C. Okay, so let's carry on. That C takes us to, so this takes us to our familiar M5B, which is about voice leading. So the voice leading, which was coming down to this F sharp, has now risen up to that C, and it's going through this changing tone, right, which is taking us to that B. So the voice leading going from C to B. So let's carry on. This is something you've got to watch out for. This is M4E. M4E is 5 chromatic notes in a line: B, B flat, A flat, G. Right, it's a tricky one. This, you've got to really look at the notes to see. M4E can then go into a scale thing or an arpeggio, or also it's going into a scaley type thing. So let's just carry on. Right, Parker then goes into a D major tetrachord, right? D major tetrachord, which works that way on D major, but descending will work on A7. So I think this is anticipation of A7, but it also works, if you go back one more, on the E minor. So this is, which is really a dominant type. A descending D major tetrachord is normally associated with dominant chords, so the A7, which is a perfect fifth back. But if you go perfect fifth back again and change it to minor, it works on a minor chord as well. Look, so you've got E and G, which work on the minor chord. So quite clever little playing by Charlie Parker. He's actually put in a tetrachord that works on both the E minor and the A7 chord, which we're going to. So if he kind of plays out like a B to 2 art, it's still going to work that bit. It's a good linking thing. We've got a chromatic line then moving down to this C sharp, which sets up, if I just carry on, C sharp diminished 7. Now in the key of D, which we're in here, C sharp, the 7th chord, C sharp, would be C sharp half, what the Americans call a half diminished, and what we British call a C sharp minor 7 flat 5, which is much more descriptive if you ask me. But here we've got a C sharp diminished, so the note that's different from the half diminished is that B flat, which is the flat 9 on A7, and that's one of the notes I want to be talking about. Notice that note is actually off the B, and we've got half. It's using it as a half step leading down to this A here. So let's carry on. Here we've got an E minor tetrachord, which actually works very well on this A7, although E minor tetrachord would probably work better on B minor or B7, because you've got the F sharp and the A, which is in both B minor 7 and B7. So, but he's using it as that's a 6, which is the 13th tension on that A7. So it works all right, very clever. Okay, so here we've got a strange thing. It's not a chromatic line, look, because between that B and C sharp is a full tone. So, and between that B flat and D, we've got a major third. So that's a strange line going down. But actually, some of you will probably recognise that as part of a bebop scale, and this B flat should actually be an A sharp on that D. And this is actually registering as D major bebop scale. We'll talk about this later on, okay, but I'll just put that little question mark in to say that that was something that was not normally played at that time, okay? Parker then plays a E minor tetrachord, right? Again, very nice layer, which would normally fit on B7. So if you look at it, it's working very nicely on this D, and the relative minor of D would be B minor 7, which you would normally see that on the B minor chord, the E, the descending E minor tetrachord, but it will also work on B7. So again, this is a good linking tetrachord between the D and the B7. Okay, so we'll just carry on. Okay, so Charlie Parker here is playing E flat diminished 7, which would normally go to E. So that's alright, because if you're looking at E where we're going to, this is like the 7th, this would be the 7th chord. Again, we've got this one note extra here, this C, which doesn't fit with that B7, it'd be a flat 9 again. So that's another note to look at, why he's using that. And then you can see that this is going into M5B. He's basically doing what he did for earlier on. So we've got M5B, again voice leading, C to B to A to that G there, you see. Just carry on. Right, just here we've got an ornamental changing tone approached by leap. You can see this is the leap here, it's leaping from that B, we're repeating, changing tone goes up, it's like a classical type, but then it repeats, and then we're finishing on G. So those notes are all leading to G, okay? Let's carry on. We've got voice leading again here. Got the voice leading's moved to G, and arpeggio, which is called M1, is taking us up. So now the voice leading's gone up to that S sharp. Let's carry on. Okay, so this arpeggio here is A6, right? So this is really on this A7 chord. It's not really, if you look at it, you've got a F sharp and a C sharp on beat, which is not really going with that E minor. So this is really played in anticipation of that A7. He's elaborating this, he's extending this line, he's carrying it on through this A7. And if you look, we've got this pair here, A to C sharp, A to C sharp repeating, which is kind of spelling out a changing tone leading to that B. And then this all arpeggiator thing is basically elaboration. See, here he's playing A6 arpeggio, but here it's not quite A6, is it? You've got A, C sharp, you've got the E, we're playing F natural, so this is again a strange note. Now I think that's wrong, that note. It shouldn't be F natural, it should be E sharp to emphasise the sharpened fifth, and this is another note that I'll be talking about in this video. Let's carry on. Right, this line here, I don't know what this is. I ain't seen this before. Well, I've seen it before, but I don't know what they call it. It's basically a line. If you look, it's just like that's like E G B. It's like E minor, but it's running to F. But it's actually this line is actually running from that B. It's running down up that F to that A there. So again, it's voice leading, and this is kind of like elaborating the voice leading. So we're going from that B there to that A there to that G there, if you see. So just carry on. The voice line is going from that A to that G, and then from G we've got a line running up. So we've got an arpeggio which is taken to that E, and that E comes from that F. So the voice line went from F sharp. Remember, this is M1 taken to F sharp, to F, and then we're going to E. So just carry on now, and that's it basically. So we'll look at the voice leading now. If you look at Charlie Parker's voice line, it's really good. We've got to that A, we're coming down G, F sharp, we've got M1 taking us back up, C to that B, and then that leads to that B there, and then this is running down, this line's running down to that D, right, which is then going to this C here through M5B, and then that's taking us down to this line here. This is basically a converging figure to A. Then we're going through a changing tone to G. M1's taking it up to F sharp. That's leading us to that F natural there, which is leading to E there. Then at the bottom, we're going from this G. It seems to be rising to that B there, and then that's going to A to G. And then these lines seem to all go down to A. This is arpeggiated down, but you don't really have to, because the main line is this F sharp F to E. That's finishing. It's just like Parker's setting up another line if the lines are going to continue, but he just finishes it off there. It's really good voice leading that. It's fantastic actually. So let's have a look now at the notes that I'm going to be looking at in this video. Okay, these are notes I'm going to be looking at in this video. Well, I'm not going to be looking at that one. I'll just talk about that in a second. I've missed one here. This C here. This C here on this E flat diminished, right, is a flat 9 on that B7. I also want to talk about that as well. So I'll just circle that after. I can't see this, but you will see a little circle appear on that. This here, I've already told you that this is basically an 11th, which is an avoid note on D, but because Parker's playing it on the 4th beat and elaborating it with M2, so he's playing that A as well, it's alright really, it's alright, you can play it okay, no problem. This note is a flat 9 on that B7, which we need to explain. This is a flat 9 on that A7, which we need to explain. Notice that they're off the beat, by the way. It's very important to note that they're off the beat. Here we've got this strange note, which is actually, we all know now, it's part of a bebop scale, so I need to explain that note. And here this F natural, which I believe is an actual E sharp, which would be a sharp 5, so I need to explain that as well. So we'll come back to this, right, but now I'm going to go into the theory, which is going to be a bit complicated, take a bit of time. So if I were you, I'd go and get yourself a cup of tea and just have a little rest, because this next bit you might find a little bit hard to understand, but it isn't really hard to understand. It's quite simple. Just got to take it in bit by bit, okay? Hello, welcome back to Bebop Review. My name is Andy Shaw. This is Levin and Wilson Part 4. First of all, I just want to look at this statement by Biddy Fleet, which we looked at in episode 2 of this series. Fleet says, the voices of my chords had a theme within themselves. You could call a tune and I'd voice my chords in such a way that I'd play the original chords to the tune and I'd invert them every 1, 2, 3 or 4 beats, so the top notes of my inversions would be another tune. It would not be the melody of the tune I'm playing, yet the chord foundation wise is the chorus of the tune. Basically all he's saying he's doing is playing inversions, which is this basically. So this is basically what Biddy Fleet's talking about. It's just chords in inversions. We're in bass clef, so this bottom line is G. So that's G major, right? A G major triad in root position. This is obviously the same chord in first inversion, and this is in second version. You just look at where the position is, you see. That's a G7 chord in root position. That's it in first inversion, that's in second version, and that one's in third inversion. And these figures here are just figured bass figures which people use, but that's not what Charlie Parker was really saying when he was talking in his interview. The other statement that he made to Leonard Feather about playing relative majors, so this is not really what Charlie Parker's playing at, but this is probably what Biddy Fleet was actually playing when he was playing the guitar for Charlie Parker. And it's very important actually to understand. Biddy Fleet is basically saying that when he was playing the guitar as Charlie Parker was soloing, he was inverting the chords. That is, this root position here was changing, right? And the top notes of the chords were changing as well. So I think we can understand that, so keep that in mind. So we'll move on. Okay, so this is the actual statement from the Downbeat magazine. Parker says, I kept thinking there's bound to be something else, he recalls. I could hear it sometimes, but I couldn't play it. So he's making out as though he's hearing something that he can't play. And then he's saying, working over Cherokee with Fleet, Charlie suddenly found that by using higher intervals of a chord as a melody line. So if you talk about higher intervals, you talk about 9s, 11s and 13s, which is actually, as Thomas Owens says, if we can just show you Thomas Owens' statement in Bebop and its Players. So this snippet from Thomas Owens' book says, higher intervals presumably refers to 9s, 11s and 13s added to simpler chords, but harmonic enrichment of this sort was part of jazz for years before 1939. In Bix Beiderbecke's, sometimes Awkward's borrowing from the music of the French Impressionists, in Ellington's compositions, in Tatum's ornate runs, and elsewhere. So Thomas Owens saying, there's no. So what? He's talking about playing high intervals of a chord, flying along at high intervals, but it's nothing new. It's all been done before. But like I say again, this is not what Parker's actually meaning. He is playing 9s, 11s and 13s, because you only got to look at his music to see that he does do that. But when he's talking about this sound he can hear but he can't play, it's something different. So let's go back to Downbeat, the Downbeat article. He also says, look here, Charleston found out using higher into the chord as a melody line, and he says, and backing them with appropriate related changes. See, that's very strange. Why would he say something like that? I'm backing them with appropriate related changes. I think the appropriate related changes we're talking about is the inversions that Biddy Fleet was playing. That is, he can play these notes he's hearing or he can hear them as the chords are changing, as Biddy Fleet is playing different chords. So Charlie suddenly found he could use higher intervals of a chord, but we're not talking about 9s and 13s, we're actually talking about something else which I'm going to explain. He could, and by using appropriate related changes, that is, the changes in certain inversions, he could play this thing he'd been hearing. Fleet ticked it up behind him and Bop was born. So there's also the other statement, I'll go back, the Koch one, which I think is important. I'll just show you that one. Right, this is statements in Koch's book on Charlie Parker by Leonard Feather. Leonard Feather told Koch, for instance, that Charlie Parker says to him, for instance, we found that you could play a relative major. See, this brings in something else again. A relative major using the right inversion. That is the right inversion that is played on the guitar that Biddy Fleet was playing against the 7th chord, and we played around with fretted fifths. Now, I think this now, by putting this in with the original statement and what Biddy Fleet said himself about playing, we can kind of get to know what what Parker's talking about. And the strange thing is that when you actually look into it very carefully, you can see that bebop scales are made from this thing that Parker's talking about. So we'll actually go into it and have a look now at. We've got to go right back in time now to the Greeks, okay, to understand what Parker's saying. So just carry on now. Okay, so I'm watching a video by somebody called Walk That Bass, who's a YouTube creator. I'll put this video that I'm watching now underneath this video, so you can click to it and watch it yourself if you want, if you don't really understand the overtone series. So basically, this is what happens when you pluck a string. The first harmonic, or the way that string's vibrating like that, is a C, and then it vibrates twice as fast as well, which is another C. And then you can see here it's into thirds, and then that note would be a G, and then we'd go back to a C again, and then this note would be a E, and then this note would be a G, and then last one would be a B flat, which would be out of tune. Okay, so this is basically what's happening when you put that string. You're getting this fundamental note, which is this. On this one, I think it's yeah, it's C. So we've got this C at bottom. Then we're playing it, the first harmonic, or the first overtone. The second harmonic is a C, and then above that you've got this G, and then you've got a C again, then you've got E, and then G again, and then this one's out of tune, this seventh one. But they write it down as approximate B flat. Okay. So if we just look at a TTC video, so if we look at this still from the video of David Kung of the TTC course, the teaching company course. This is on how music and mathematics relate. Very good little series of videos. I can definitely recommend it. If you look at the fundamentals, you can see that this one's quite loud. If this was C, that'd be. He's actually putting the note A, right? But let's just call it C for now for illustrations. So this would be C, and you see it's quite loud. And then we've got the next harmonic up, and that's also C, an octave higher, and you can see that's quite loud. Then you've got this G above this C, that's quite loud. Then above that you've got another C, which is not quite loud. Then above that C you've got an E, which is quite up there, look, but not as intense. And then you've got this G down here, and then this is a B flat, which is out of tune. Right, so you can see that these first harmonics are spaced really nice, because as they go further on they get so cramped together, he just sounds a mess, you know what I mean? But these first ones, you can you can hear the first six seem to be, you know, if you play a very, very low note on an instrument, on a low sounding instrument, you can hear these higher intervals on it, right? A saxophone plays very similar to this. You've got a fundamental and very loud harmonics. A clarinet doesn't play like this. It's the harmonics are that would be loud on a clarinet. Then that would be soft. That would be loud, soft. It's like that clarinet. It's completely different. It's amazing, isn't it? Just changing the bore of the instrument, because a clarinet is cylindrical and a saxophone's conical, really alters the harmonics. Here, this is related to this violin, which Professor Kung is actually playing. But I want to just show you that these notes are sounding. Every time you play one note, you're actually in all that. Now, what's that got to do with Charlie Parker and what we're actually speaking about? Well, if we look at the harmonic series and look at these first spaced out notes, we can see that these are the notes at the bottom. We're basically spelling out a major triad, aren't we? You know what I mean? We've got C's, G's, E's, G's, and then we go to this out of tune bit, then there's still another C, you know what I mean? But these first six, which you can hear, the ones that you can hear, because these they start going too high and too close together and they get muddy. But these first ones you can hear, right? They're happening all the time on any note you play. So, if you're actually playing a chord, right? If you're actually playing a chord like these, there's harmonics on every single one of those notes, right? There's harmonics on the E, there's harmonics on the harmonics on the G, harmonics on the B, and harmonics on the D, right? So if we look at that, I'll write it out in Sibelius, and we'll look at it and see what we actually get. Okay. Okay, so I've just written the chords out in, well, the chord out in Sibelius. This is a C major trad. Now if you look, we've got the C at the bottom, this is the E, and this is the D. I haven't put it as a chord playing, I've put it as separate notes, because I want to show you the notes that are played above the harmonics that you're hearing above each of those sounds. On the C, we're hearing an E and a G, and that's basically what spells the chord, don't we? Because we play an E and a G to represent the chord. On the E, though, if you put it into the E at the bottom, right, and just listen to the E, you're not getting E, G, C, right, which you actually would be playing if you're playing this in first inversion. What you're hearing from the harmonics on the E is E, G sharp, B. You're hearing this major trad. So you've got this C sharp, which is very different. When it's in second inversion, here, look, you've got G, B, D, right? So you've got the B and the D are obviously different, but these are all in key. The note that's not in key is this G sharp, which is in when the chord is actually played from E. That's what you're hearing. You're hearing on that E a G sharp, and that's, I think this is what Parker believed he was hearing. He was hearing this G sharp when the chord was being played in an inversion. He was hearing this E and this G sharp. He could hear it, but he couldn't play it. You can't really play that G sharp on a C because it wouldn't sound very good. But Parker doesn't play them on beat. He plays the G sharp off the beat, and this is where bebop scales come from. You add that note into your normal major scale, and you create a bebop scale. But it comes from the harmonics. The actual fact that Parker heard these notes within the harmonics, and it actually works this on all the bebop scales, really. I'll just show you on a 7th chord on G7. Okay, so this is the G7 chord, G, B, D, F. The harmonics on the G, you can see a B, D, which you'd expect, which spell out the chord, you know, the first 3 notes of the chord. But if you look at the B, you've got a D sharp and an F sharp. The strongest harmonic is obviously the 5th, the F sharp, because it appears early. Because from this, the harmonics would be B, would be the fundamental, then you would get another B, then you would get the F sharp, that would appear first. This D sharp appears on the 5th harmonic, a bit further up, so it's weaker than this F sharp. But if you look at here on the D, you get the 3rd, which is the 5th harmonic, obviously, on this, is also F sharp. So you're getting a domination of F sharps on this G. And basically, this is again what Parker plays when he plays offbeat scale runs. He doesn't play the F sharp on the chord, because if you play an F sharp on the G7, you're just changing it into G major 7, aren't you? But playing it off the beat in bebop scales, it just plays lovely, doesn't it? And that's what happens. As David Baker said in his book on bebop scales, you add this F sharp to the standard Mixolydian scale, and that creates the bebop scale, the dominant bebop scale. So let's have a look at the subdominant chord, D minor now. Okay, so if we look at the subdominant chord, the D minor 7, obviously from the D we get not the minor spelling this time, but the major. So we're basically getting this F sharp coming in, which is different. On the F, we're just getting normal FAC. On the A, we're getting a C sharp. Obviously, that's a major trad. So we get a C sharp, and then on the C, E, G, right? So we're getting 2 notes, actually, that are different here. Now, David Baker, in his book, says that you played the dominant scale on the minor chord, which would be that F sharp, would be the note, the added note. And Parker does do that. Yes, I agree with David Baker. That's what I've seen as well, that I do see these F sharps appearing. But I have to say that I've also seen this note appear in the C sharp in scale runs descending. So both these notes do appear on the on the minor chord, you know, on a 2 chord. So this also works out to me in theory as well. What Parker's playing and what's actually happening in the harmonics on the D minor is, it just all works out to me. So we can actually look, not now not just on these notes, but we can look to see what the added notes are, not just on the chord, but in the chord function. And does this happen in chord function? And I can tell you now that I've actually looked at this, it does. It happens in chord function. So let's just have a look at the different chords in each key. Okay. Okay, so if we look at chord function, tonic function chord, C major, this is in the key of C major, by the way. C major, E minor or E minor 7, A minor or A minor 7. The added note is G sharp, and that's what, if you put it into scale form, that's what it looks like. Subdominant chords, which are D minor and F major. The added notes are either a C sharp or an F sharp. So you can either play dominant scale, right, which is that one there, the dominant underneath, or this scale, which I've seen Parker play. He descends on this scale on Coco. There's an F major chord being played, and he actually descends that using that scale. So I've definitely seen that scale being used on a subdominant chord. And the dominant chord, this one, you see it quite a lot with the added note F sharp. I just want to say something about these. Charlie Parker actually saw these notes as added notes, not as actually making scales. So we see them in scale form, but basically a lot of the time they're not actually used in scale form. They're just added notes that are used mainly off the beats and kind of like in voice leading lines. So let's go back now. I've actually showed you this. You can actually look at this yourself. But let's have a look. Go back to Clandestine, a solo that I chose out of the Charlie Parker Comedy book completely at random. I'm actually telling you, I'm telling the truth here. I took that solo completely at random because I want to see if this theory holds out. If I can explain it using this theory. Those little notes that we saw that were a bit strange for the times. Okay, so let's go back to Clandestine and have a look at that. Okay, so we're looking back at Clandestine. All these notes that I've actually circled. I actually talked about this first one, didn't I? I said that it's a non-harmonic note, a G, which is an avoid note on that D chord, but it was alright because you played A. Now that is the standard reply from somebody who studied David Baker, because that's what David Baker says in his book, that you should make the middle tone the tone of the chord. And it's okay, I've got no problem with that. But I actually don't think that that's what that note is. I think that note is anticipating this B7 chord. If you look at that B7 chord, the harmonics on the D sharp include that G. Let me just show you. Okay, so this note is actually, if we look at it from the Levin and Wilson controversy, right, it's operating on the second. This is the relative major that Charlie Parker's talking about, right? It's the second note of B7, which is D sharp, and these are the harmonics that they're playing. That's the fifth, the strongest, and then you've got this F sharp. Right, this F double sharp. This F double sharp is the same as G. That note should actually be called an F double sharp by rights, if you're actually thinking Levin Wilson, right? So it's in anticipation moving to this B7 chord, right? So this note is actually sharp 5, isn't it? It's the other harmonic. That's the one we normally see, that A sharp, which is part of this bebop scale running down from B, A sharp, A. But then you've got this other note here that Parker's playing in anticipation. So that's where I see that coming from, okay? So let's move on. This chord, which goes from B7 to E minor, I think Parker's actually playing E7. He's actually thinking E7. He's actually thinking extended dominance here. So this would be E7, right? The second note of E7 is G sharp, and what do we get? We get B sharp, which is the same as that C. So really, that should be called a B sharp. So this note that is looking a bit strange, right? It's actually this B sharp again. It's a sharp 5 because we're talking about this weaker harmonic. That's a stronger one, which we should normally see. I've actually seen that on the D sharp. It's usually running down in scales though, but this one he's using as voice leading. Can you see? He uses them as voice leading. That's a voice leading line. Look, A, G, F sharp, and then voice leadings go back up, and then we're back into voice leading off the beat with this harmonic, which is B sharp. That should really be a B sharp, right? And then that is running down to that B, which is perfectly on the E7 chord. You know what I mean? It's kind of like anticipating the C7, so it's kind of like starting E7 here, even though we're in B, we're still in B7. Okay, so these are kind of like seeing what I'm actually seeing Parker doing. So let's move on. Okay, so now we've come to this flat 9 on the A7 chord, right? I think that we're actually moving into D here, anticipating D, because if you look at all these notes from that B going down there, down there, down there to there, that is a D major bebop scale. All those notes are in D major, okay? D major bebop, that is. And we're starting from offbeat from this B flat, which is a flat 9 on this A7, right? So this A7 is actually starting here, right, I think. And it's just this is actually a perfect example of Levin and Wilson. He's playing this sharp 5 on the D off the beat, not on the beat. You don't want to play it on the beat because you can sound off with the fifth of the chord. So looking at this note that's a B flat on this A7 chord, we can actually see that it's part of this bebop scale on this D major chord. In fact, all these notes here running down are part of the D major bebop scale. Now Parker's actually seen these as added notes, but when you put them in a line like this, it actually creates a bebop scale. And all those notes right in there, from there, there, are all spelling out D, B major bebop scale, as David Baker would say in his book. But notice how Parker's put this off the beat, right, to lead into that. So it's not really acting as a flat 9 on this A7. It's off the beat, and it should be a sharp. Now, if you look at the chord of D on the the second note, which is F sharp, because D, F sharp, A is a trad, isn't it? So on the F sharp, look, you've got this A sharp. That's what that note is. It's A sharp, and that note's A sharp. It's the second. It's a note that's on the harmonic. You know what I mean? On the major scale, there's only one that's out of key, right? And it's that, the A sharp. So as I showed you earlier in C. On C major, it would have been G sharp though, wouldn't it? So this is the D major bebop scale running down, and that's where the note comes from, that harmonic there. It's amazing, isn't it, this? I think that is a really good example of what I've been saying. That is very, very strong evidence of Parker using harmonics, right? Not playing a flat 9, but a sharpened 5th on a D chord, and it's being used as anticipation. The D is starting here. You remember when I was talking about this, I says that we've got an F sharp and an A, so this is actually a 13th on that A7. It works all right, but look now, it's perfect. You've got A and F sharp on beat, which goes with D. So again, stronger evidence that this is actually happening. Right, so let's move on. Okay, so I'm quite happy about this going down to D. We're into B7 here, look. If I put a B at the bottom there of this E flat diminished chord, it spells B7 flat 9, and this is the flat 9. Now this flat 9 is again, I think, part of a harmonic sequence. It's played in anticipation of an E7 chord, right? So this is actually E7, right? So this note here, right, is acting as a flat 9 on this B7, but it's also a harmonic on this E7, because if you look at E7, the second note of E7 is G sharp. G sharp can be seen as A flat, so you go A flat, C. You know what I mean? So this is like again the 5th harmonic, a C natural. So it's part of this E7, right, which is leading in. Again, Parker's using it as voice leading, you see. He's coming down C, and then B, this is going to B, and then down to that A, you see. So it's a very clever move, and we're obviously dead into E7 here, this B, and then we're moving through A, like we're moving towards A7 here through this ornamental changing tone, and then A7 starts here. So we'll carry on. Right, so just here, this note here that Parker's come to, this F natural. Again, if you look at the A7, which we're actually playing on, this is the second, obviously the second note of the scale of the chord, which would be C sharp. A7 is A, C sharp, E, G, isn't it? So C sharp, we look at the second harmonic again. We've got E sharp, which is the same as F, so that actually should be really written down as E sharp. Parker's again using this in voice leading. Can you see he's going from this F sharp? This is a main voice leading line that's starting here. He's brought the voice leading down here. Can you see, as I said, to that G? Taking up, we're going from F sharp now to F. So he's using this harmonic, which is basically a harmonic on this A7. Right, off the beat again. Don't play it on the beat, play it off the beat as a part of voice leading. And then this pattern here is kind of like taking you down to this bit here. I didn't understand at first, but I've actually played it, and it's a pattern that goes basically it takes you round to that E there. This could be seen as voice leading, but I'll listen to the record. In fact, I'll let you listen to the record very slowly. Now you can hear there that these notes at the bottom here, these at the bottom, are very weak, you know, in comparison to these. So the voice leading is going up here. I actually played this to have a look to see where the voice leading was going, and it seems to be going from this F natural to that E, and then if this carried on it'd be to a D. So I've just wrote something out in Band in a Box to illustrate this ending. So this is basically the end of Charlie Parker's solo on Clun Stance. These are the last two bars, A7 going to A minor, and then this D7. What I've done is I've kind of just finished it off. It wouldn't actually finish on it because it's D7. You'd want to finish on the G chord, which is the next chord. So we're moving into the key of G here, right? He's playing this note here, this B flat, which is kind of like an harmonic on that D. If you look, it could go from that B, the voicing could go from that B to that B flat, and if you continued with this line that I've just wrote, this little line here, it could go down to A. But when you actually listen to it, the voice line is going from this E to this, this F to this E, and then you can hear it going from the D running down to this A. So it's really stronger on this top line. So just have a listen to that. So you can hear the actual voice leads up here, these accented high notes, these notes that are accented. And when you listen to the record, the Charlie Parker record, these are the notes that are accented. So these are actually giving the voice leading, not these notes down here. You can hardly hear that B flat, if it is a B flat, which is actually, it's making it like a kind of voice leading line here, although he's using changing tones to emphasise that G, you see. So the voice leading might go from that A down there, but it does seem stronger going from B flat to A in this line I've written. But you can hardly hear all this. What's the real strong voice leading is this top line here. So that's how I see it going there. And I'm not sure whether that note is actually part of it, but this is definitely, I think, an harmonic on that A7 chord, which is sharp 5, which is actually an E sharp. Everything else, this could be an anticipation of this D7 chord, but I can't hear that at all. It might just be an ordinary B, that, you know what I mean? But B flat would be okay if it were going down to that A, you know, just better as voice leading. So anyway, that's it. That's how I see that, and that's how I explain the Levin and Wilson controversy, which everybody's been talking about for years. So now you can either have a look at it yourself and see if what I say makes sense, or you can think I'm talking a complete load of rubbish and just reject it, which is, again, quite alright. But thank you for watching this video and this series, and I may see you again in another one of my videos. Okay, bye.